I arrived at the airport for my son's wedding and saw my tickets had been canceled. The words on the screen blurred together as I stared at the check-in kiosk. My boarding passes nowhere to be found in the system.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
David's wedding was supposed to start in 6 hours in Miami, and I was standing in Denver International Airport with nothing but a confirmation email that apparently meant nothing. My hands shook as I approached the counter. The young woman behind the desk had kind eyes, the sort that made you want to trust her with your problems. "Ma'am, I'm showing that these tickets were canceled yesterday evening," she said, typing rapidly. "It looks like it was done by someone with access to the booking." "That's impossible," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't impossible at all. Brittany had insisted on handling all the wedding arrangements, including my flight. "This is my son's wedding." The agent's expression softened. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can show that would get you on a flight to Miami today. Everything's booked solid." I walked away from the counter in a daze, pulling out my phone with trembling fingers. David answered on the second ring. "Mom, aren't you supposed to be on a plane?" "Honey, my tickets were canceled. I'm stranded at the airport." There was a long pause. Then I heard muffled voices in the background, Brittany's voice rising above the others. David came back on the line. "Mom, Brittany says she sent you an email about the change in plans. Didn't you get it?" I scrolled through my inbox frantically. Nothing. "I didn't get any email, David. What change in plans?" More muffled conversation. This time I could make out Brittany's words clearly. "Tell her we'll explain later. The venue is too small anyway." "Mom, I'm sorry, but we had to make some last-minute adjustments to the guest list." "The venue." His voice trailed off. "The venue what, David? The venue is smaller than we thought. We had to cut some people." "Cut some people." His mother. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "I see," I managed to say. "Well, congratulations then. I hope you have a beautiful day." I hung up before he could respond and stood in the middle of the busy airport, people rushing past me with their rolling suitcases and coffee cups and purposeful expressions. I had never felt so invisible in my life. The drive home took forever. Every song on the radio seemed designed to mock me. Happy couples, families, celebrations. I turned it off and drove in silence, my wedding outfit hanging in the back seat like a ghost of the day that should have been. Helen was watering her petunias when I pulled into my driveway. She looked up with surprise. "Linda, what are you doing back? I thought you were flying to Miami this morning." I couldn't bring myself to explain it all standing there on the sidewalk, so I just said, "Plans changed." But Helen had known me for 15 years. She set down her watering can and walked over to my car. "Honey, you look like you've seen a ghost." "What happened?" That's when I started crying. Not the gentle tears of disappointment, but the ugly, gasping sobs of someone who's just realized they don't matter as much as they thought they did. Helen helped me inside and made tea while I sat at my kitchen table, still wearing the navy dress I'd picked out specially for my son's wedding. The dress I'd bought 3 months ago when I was still invited. "Tell me everything," Helen said, settling into the chair across from me. So I did. I told her about the canceled tickets, about David's phone call, about Brittany's voice in the background treating my exclusion like a minor inconvenience. Helen listened without interrupting, her face growing darker with each detail. "Linda, that's not right," she said when I finished. "Cutting the mother of the groom from the wedding? There's something more going on here." I wanted to argue with her, to defend David and Brittany, to find some reasonable explanation for why I was sitting in my kitchen instead of watching my only child get married. But I couldn't find the words. "You know," Helen said slowly, "I've been meaning to mention something. I saw Brittany at First National Bank last week." She looked upset, arguing with someone at the desk. When she saw me, she practically ran out of there. I looked up from my teacup. "What day was that?" "Tuesday, I think. The same day you said you were going to finalize your flight details. The same day my tickets were canceled." Something cold and sharp settled in my stomach. Helen was right. There was something more going on here, and for the first time since I'd left the airport, I felt something other than sadness. I felt suspicious. "Helen," I said, setting down my cup, "would you mind if I asked you to keep an eye on things around here for the next few days? I have a feeling I'm going to need to do some digging." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Of course, honey. Whatever you need." As I walked her to the door, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. I looked older than my 62 years, tired and defeated. But there was something else in my eyes now, something that hadn't been there when I'd left for the airport this morning. Determination. If Brittany thought she could just erase me from my son's life without explanation, she was about to learn that Linda Thompson wasn't as easy to dismiss as she thought. The wedding was happening right now, 3 time zones away. David was probably standing at the altar, looking handsome in his tuxedo, waiting for his bride. And I was here, still in my wedding guest dress, planning my first move in a game I was just beginning to understand I'd been playing for months without knowing it. The phone rang just as Helen left. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking it might be David calling to apologize, to explain, to make this right. But the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Thompson? The voice was professional, unfamiliar. This is Jennifer Martinez from First National Bank. We need to discuss some unusual activity on your accounts. Unusual activity? I repeated, my voice catching slightly. The bank representative's call felt like another blow to an already devastating day. Yes, ma'am. We've noticed several large transactions over the past few months that seem inconsistent with your normal spending patterns. We wanted to verify these were authorized by you. I sank into my kitchen chair, still wearing my wedding dress. What kind of transactions? Credit card applications, balance transfers, and some significant purchases. Can you come in tomorrow morning? I'd prefer to discuss the details in person. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my kitchen, pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve starting to fit together. The canceled tickets, Brittany's nervous behavior at the bank, and now unusual activity on my accounts. I forced myself to change out of the dress and into comfortable clothes, then settled at my computer. If I was going to figure out what was happening, I needed to start with what I knew. Over the past 2 years, since David and Brittany got married, I'd noticed changes. Small things at first. Canceled dinner plans, shortened phone calls, excuses about being too busy for visits. I'd attributed it to the natural adjustment period of a new marriage, the way young couples needed space to build their life together. But as I sat there thinking, the pattern became clearer and more disturbing. Last Christmas, Brittany had called 2 days before our planned celebration to say they'd decided to spend the holiday with her family instead. It's just easier this year, Linda. You understand. I'd spent Christmas alone for the first time since David was born. My birthday in March had been similar. They'd made plans to take me to dinner, then canceled the morning of because Brittany had a work emergency. The same work emergency that apparently required posting photos of them at an expensive resort on social media that weekend. Easter, Mother's Day, the 4th of July. Each holiday had brought a new excuse, a new reason why including me was inconvenient or complicated. And each time, I'd accepted their explanations because I didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law, the clingy mom who couldn't let her son grow up. I'd been so focused on giving them space that I hadn't noticed I was being systematically excluded from their lives. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Sorry about today, Mom. We'll make it up to you when we get back from the honeymoon. Love you. I stared at the message for a long time. Sorry about today, as if missing his wedding was a minor inconvenience, like a rained-out picnic or a delayed flight. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and began going through my bank statements online. What I found made my hands shake all over again. 3 credit cards I didn't remember applying for. 2 with substantial balances, $8,000 on one, $12,000 on another. Purchases at high-end stores I'd never been to, payments to vendors I didn't recognize, cash advances I'd never taken. The most recent charges were all from the past month. Wedding-related expenses by the looks of it. Florists, caterers, a luxury hotel in Miami, thousands and thousands of dollars charged to cards in my name. I was paying for the wedding I hadn't been invited to. My doorbell rang at 9 o'clock. Helen stood on my porch with a plate of cookies and a concerned expression. I couldn't stop thinking about you, she said. How are you holding up? I showed her into the living room and poured 2 glasses of wine. Then I told her about the bank's call and what I'd found in my accounts. Helen's face grew grim as I explained the charges, the pattern of exclusion, the systematic way I'd been erased from David and Brittany's life while unknowingly funding it. Linda, this is fraud, she said when I finished. Identity theft. You need to call the police. I can't, I said immediately. David doesn't know. I'm sure David doesn't know. Helen gave me a look I'd seen before, the same expression she'd worn when her own daughter had been in an abusive relationship, and Helen had tried for years to make excuses for the boyfriend's behavior. "Honey," she said gently, "how can you be sure?" It was the question I'd been avoiding all evening. David was a smart man, a college graduate with a good job in sales. He handled his own finances, paid attention to details. How could he not know his wife was using his mother's credit to pay for their lifestyle? "I don't know," I admitted. "But I have to believe he doesn't know. Because if he does know..." I couldn't finish the sentence. If David knew, if he was part of this, then I had lost more than my place at his wedding. I had lost my son entirely. Helen stayed until almost midnight, helping me print out bank statements and credit reports. The full scope of the fraud was staggering. Nearly $40,000 in debt accumulated over 18 months, all in my name, all for expenses that had funded David and Brittany's increasingly lavish lifestyle. The wedding alone had cost $25,000, money I supposedly spent on a celebration I wasn't allowed to attend. After Helen left, I sat in my living room looking at the evidence spread across my coffee table. Bills for flowers I'd never smelled, food I'd never tasted, music I'd never heard, a photographer's invoice for capturing memories I'd never see. I thought about David as a little boy, how he used to save his allowance to buy me flowers on Mother's Day, how he'd call me every Sunday during college just to check in, how he'd held my hand at his father's funeral and promised he'd always take care of me. Somewhere along the way, that promise had been forgotten, or worse, it had been deliberately broken. My phone rang at 11:30. David's name flashed on the screen. "Mom?" His voice sounded different, maybe affected by the wine at his reception. "I just wanted to call and say, I'm sorry about today. Really sorry." "Are you?" I asked quietly. "Of course I am. You're my mother. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did hurt me, David. And I'm starting to think it wasn't an accident." There was a long pause. I could hear music and laughter in the background, the sounds of a party I should have been part of. "Mom, can we talk about this when I get back? It's complicated." "I imagine it is," I said, "especially when there are credit cards involved." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. "We'll talk when I get back," he said finally, and hung up. I sat holding the phone for a long time after the call ended. My son knew. Maybe not all of it, maybe not every detail, but he knew enough. He knew enough to feel guilty, enough to call me on his wedding night, enough to admit it was complicated. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet and dark. Everyone else was sleeping peacefully, unaware that Linda Thompson's world had completely shifted on its axis in the space of a single day. I gathered up the papers from my coffee table and put them in a folder. Tomorrow I would go to the bank and begin the process of reclaiming my identity and my finances. I would file reports and dispute charges and probably involve lawyers. But tonight, I would sit with the truth that hurt more than the fraud itself. My son had known what his wife was doing to me, and he had chosen her over me anyway. The realization should have broken my heart. Instead, it did something unexpected. It set me free. For the first time in 2 years, I knew exactly where I stood with David and Brittany. There were no more excuses to make, no more benefit of the doubt to give, no more hope that things would go back to the way they used to be. They had shown me who they were, and now I could decide who I was going to be in response. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror again. I looked different than I had that morning. Older, yes, but also somehow stronger. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and painful choices. But tonight, I went to bed with something I hadn't felt in months: clarity. And in that clarity, I began to plan my next move. The next morning, I arrived at First National Bank 15 minutes early. Jennifer Martinez was a woman about my age with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She led me into a private office and closed the door. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to be direct with you. What we've found suggests systematic identity theft over an extended period. Someone with access to your personal information has been very busy." She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of applications, signatures that looked like mine but weren't quite right, and a timeline that made my stomach turn. The fraud had started just 2 months after David and Brittany's wedding. The applications all came through different channels, Jennifer explained. Online, phone, even one submitted in person at our downtown branch. The person who came in person was described as a young woman, blonde, who seemed very familiar with your financial information. Brittany. Of course it was Brittany. How much? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Total credit exposure is just over $48,000. But Mrs. Thompson, there's something else. Someone also attempted to add themselves as a beneficiary to your life insurance policy. The attempt was flagged because it required your signature, which didn't match our records. My hand started shaking. It was one thing to steal from me while I was alive. It was another thing entirely to position themselves to profit from my death. Who tried to add themselves? A Brittany Thompson, listed as daughter-in-law. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. Daughter-in-law. She'd used her relationship to my son to try to steal from me twice, once while I lived, once when I died. Jennifer leaned forward. Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, do you have any idea how this person obtained your personal information? I thought about all the times Brittany had been in my house, how she'd volunteered to help me organize my paperwork last year, claiming it was good practice since she was thinking about becoming a financial planner, how she'd insisted on helping me switch to online banking, setting up passwords and security questions while I made coffee in the kitchen. Yes, I said quietly. I think I do. We spent the next hour documenting everything. Jennifer was thorough and patient, walking me through each fraudulent transaction. The wedding expenses were just the tip of the iceberg. There were cash advances for their honeymoon, charges for expensive furniture, even payments for Brittany's personal trainer and spa treatments. They'd been living off my stolen credit for over a year. What are my options? I asked when we finished. You can dispute all the charges, which will trigger a fraud investigation. Given the evidence we have, you'll likely be successful. But Mrs. Thompson, this is also a criminal matter. You should consider filing a police report. I took copies of everything and promised to think about it. But as I drove home, I knew I wasn't ready for police reports and criminal charges. Not yet. First, I needed to understand how deep this went, and whether David was truly complicit or just willfully blind. Helen was waiting on my porch when I got home, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone ready for battle. Well? She asked as soon as I got out of the car. I showed her everything: the applications, the forged signatures, the attempted beneficiary change. Helen's face grew darker with each revelation. Linda, this isn't just theft. She was planning for your death. What if you'd gotten sick? What if you'd had an accident? She would have collected your life insurance while your son mourned you. The thought made me physically sick. I excused myself to splash cold water on my face, and when I came back, Helen was on her phone. I'm calling my son-in-law, she said. He's a lawyer. You need professional help with this. Helen, I'm not sure I'm ready. Ready or not, honey. This train has left the station. That woman has stolen nearly $50,000 from you and tried to position herself to profit from your death. This isn't about hurt feelings anymore. This is about protecting yourself. By noon, I was sitting in the law office of Richard Hayes, Helen's son-in-law, listening to him explain the gravity of my situation in terms that made my head spin. Identity theft, wire fraud, forgery, attempted insurance fraud. The list went on and on. Mrs. Thompson, Richard said, leaning back in his chair. In my 20 years of practice, I've seen a lot of family financial abuse cases. This is one of the most systematic and calculating I've encountered. Your daughter-in-law didn't just steal from you impulsively. She planned this carefully over many months. But what about David, my son? Richard's expression grew gentle. That's the hardest question, isn't it? In my experience, there are usually 3 possibilities. 1, he's completely innocent and has been manipulated as thoroughly as you have. 2, he knows something's wrong but chooses not to look too closely because it benefits him. 3, he's an active participant. How do I find out which one it is? You talk to him, but not alone, and not without preparation. We're going to document everything first, build an airtight case, and then confront them together. If he's innocent, he'll be horrified and want to help make this right. If he's not. Richard didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. If David wasn't innocent, I would lose my son along with my money. That evening, I sat in my living room surrounded by evidence of my own betrayal. Credit card statements, loan documents, bank records, a paper trail of lies that stretched back 18 months. My phone kept buzzing with messages from David and Brittany, sending photos from their honeymoon. Happy couples on beaches, romantic dinners, spa treatments. All paid for with my stolen money. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. But I needed to hear his voice, needed to gauge how much he knew. "Mom, how are you doing? You seemed upset when we talked last night." His voice sounded relaxed, happy. Either he was a very good actor, or he genuinely didn't understand the magnitude of what his wife had done. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course. What's wrong?" "Do you know how your wedding was paid for?" There was a pause, a long pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you know where the money came from? The venue, the flowers, the photographer, the hotel in Miami. Do you know who paid for it?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Brittany handled all the financial arrangements. She's better with that stuff than I am." "David, that's not what I asked. I asked if you know who paid for it." "Mom, what's this about? We're on our honeymoon. Can't this wait?" His refusal to answer told me everything I needed to know. He might not know the specific details, but he knew something wasn't right. He'd chosen not to ask questions because he preferred the comfortable fiction to the uncomfortable truth. "Actually, it can't wait," I said. "When you get back from your trip, we need to have a serious conversation. You, me, Brittany, and probably some lawyers." "Lawyers?" "Mom, you're scaring me." "Good," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "You should be scared. What your wife has done is serious enough to send her to prison." I hung up before he could respond. Within 5 minutes, my phone started ringing again. David called 4 times, then Brittany called twice. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my back porch, looking out at the garden Harold and I had planted together 20 years ago. The roses were blooming, their scent carried on the evening breeze. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Tomorrow I would file the police report. I would dispute the charges and begin the long process of reclaiming my financial identity. I would prepare for the conversation that would either restore my relationship with my son or end it forever. But tonight, I was done being a victim. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Brittany. David gave me your number. We need to talk about this misunderstanding. I can explain everything. Please don't do anything rash." I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. There was nothing to misunderstand and nothing to explain. The paper trail spoke for itself. Brittany had made one critical error in her calculations. She'd assumed that because she could exclude me from David's life, she could steal from me with impunity. She'd counted on my love for my son to keep me quiet, my desire to maintain family peace to override my need for justice. She was about to learn that she'd underestimated Linda Thompson. As I got ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked different again, not defeated, not invisible, but determined, ready for whatever came next. In just 2 days, I'd discovered that my son's wife was a thief and a fraud. In discovering that, I'd also discovered something else. I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for, and I was done being anyone's victim. The police report took 3 hours to file. Detective Sarah Martinez listened patiently as I explained the timeline, the forged signatures, the systematic theft that had been happening right under my nose. She was thorough and kind, but her questions forced me to face uncomfortable truths about how naive I'd been. "Mrs. Thompson," she said as we finished, "in cases like this, the perpetrator usually starts small and escalates over time. Looking at these records, your daughter-in-law has been testing boundaries for months. Each time she got away with something, she got bolder. I thought about the first time Brittany had asked to help me organize my financial paperwork, how grateful I'd been for her offer. I'd practically handed her the keys to my identity. "What happens now?" I asked. "We'll open an investigation. With the evidence you've provided, We have a strong case. But Mrs. Thompson, I have to warn you, family fraud cases often get complicated when they go to trial. Are you prepared for that? I wasn't sure I was prepared for any of this, but I nodded anyway. David and Brittany returned from their honeymoon on a Thursday. I knew they were back because Helen saw them unloading luggage from a taxi in front of their apartment building. Expensive luggage I'd apparently paid for without knowing it. I waited until Friday evening to call. David answered on the first ring. Mom, thank God. We need to talk. Yes, we do. Can you come over tonight? Both of you. Brittany's really upset about whatever misunderstanding happened while we were gone. She's been crying all week. Misunderstanding. Even now, he was minimizing what his wife had done. It's not a misunderstanding, David. Just come over. 7 o'clock. They arrived 10 minutes late. Brittany had clearly been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her usually perfect makeup smudged. She looked younger and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Under different circumstances, I might have felt sorry for her. David looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot on my porch like a teenager in trouble. Which, in many ways, he was. Come in, I said, stepping aside. We have a lot to discuss. I'd prepared for this conversation carefully. Richard Hayes had coached me on what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. The evidence was spread across my dining room table like an indictment. Bank statements, credit reports, copies of forged applications. Brittany saw it all and went pale. She sank into a chair without being invited to sit. Mrs. Thompson, she began, her voice shaking. I can explain. No, I said firmly. You'll have your chance to talk. But first you're going to listen. Both of you. I walked them through everything. The canceled wedding tickets, the fraudulent credit cards, the forged signatures, the attempted insurance fraud. David's face grew paler with each revelation. By the time I finished, he looked sick. $48,000, I said, letting the number hang in the air. That's how much you stole from me, Brittany. Nearly $50,000 over 18 months, including the cost of a wedding I wasn't allowed to attend. I was going to pay it back, Brittany whispered. I swear, I was going to pay it all back. With what money? I asked. You don't have a job. David's salary barely covers your rent. Where exactly was this money going to come from? She couldn't answer because there was no answer. She'd never intended to pay anything back. She'd been living off my credit with no plan beyond continuing to steal until I died, and she could collect my life insurance. David finally found his voice. Mom, I swear I didn't know. Not about the credit cards, not about the insurance policy. I knew Brittany was handling the wedding finances, but I thought she had it covered somehow. How, David? How did you think a part-time yoga instructor could afford a $25,000 wedding? He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no good answer to that question either. You didn't want to know, I said quietly. It was easier to let her handle everything and not ask uncomfortable questions. That's not fair, he protested. I trust my wife. I shouldn't have to interrogate her about every financial decision. Even when those decisions involve stealing from your mother? The words hit him like a physical blow. He slumped in his chair, finally understanding the full scope of what had happened. Brittany was crying harder now, making small hiccuping sounds that might have been designed to evoke sympathy. I never meant to hurt anyone, she sobbed. I just wanted us to have a nice life. I wanted a beautiful wedding, and I knew you had money just sitting there not being used for anything important. Not being used for anything important. My retirement savings, my emergency fund, my financial security, none of it was important compared to her desire for a perfect wedding. So you decided to steal it, I said. It wasn't supposed to be stealing, I thought. I thought maybe you'd understand eventually. You're not getting any younger, and David's your only heir anyway. So really it was just advancing his inheritance. The casual cruelty of her reasoning took my breath away. She'd convinced herself that stealing from me was actually doing me a favor, that my age made my money less valuable to me than to her. And the life insurance? I asked. Was that also advancing his inheritance? She had the grace to look ashamed. That was just, in case something happened. I wanted to make sure David was protected. You wanted to make sure you were protected, I corrected. You were positioning yourself to profit from my death. David looked at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. Brittany, Jesus Christ. You tried to make yourself the beneficiary of my mother's life insurance? It wasn't like that, she said desperately. I was just trying to plan ahead, to be responsible. Responsible? David's voice was rising. You stole $50,000 from my mother and tried to position yourself to collect more money if she died, and you call that responsible? For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. David was angry, not at me, but at his wife. Maybe there was still a chance to salvage our relationship. I've filed a police report, I said quietly. There's going to be an investigation. Brittany's head snapped up. You called the police? What did you think I would do, Brittany? Let you steal from me indefinitely? Pretend this never happened so you could try again? But I'm family, she said, as if that somehow made theft acceptable. We're supposed to work things out within the family. You excluded me from the family, I reminded her. You canceled my tickets to my son's wedding and told me I was almost dead anyway, remember? You can't claim family loyalty when it suits you while treating me like an inconvenience the rest of the time. David was staring at his wife. You told my mother she was almost dead? Brittany's face crumpled completely. I was upset about the venue size. I said things I didn't mean. What exactly did you say? David's voice was dangerously quiet. I answered for her. She said you only invited people who matter, and that I was almost dead anyway. The silence that followed was deafening. David looked at Brittany like she was a stranger, someone he'd never seen before. How could you say that to my mother? He whispered. How could you be so cruel? I was stressed, Brittany said weakly. Planning a wedding is incredibly stressful. And your mother was asking so many questions about the arrangements, and I just snapped. I asked one question, I said. I asked about my flight details. That's what made you snap. David stood up abruptly. I need some air. He walked out to my back porch, leaving Brittany and me alone. She looked at me with desperate eyes. Mrs. Thompson, please. I know I made mistakes, but I love David. I love your family. Can't we find a way to work this out? I'll get a job. I'll pay back every penny. It'll take time, but I'll make this right. I studied her face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse. What I saw instead was calculation. Even now, even caught red-handed with overwhelming evidence against her, she was trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. How long? I asked. What? How long would it take you to pay back $50,000? At minimum wage, working full-time, that's about 2 years of gross income. Factor in taxes and living expenses, and you're looking at maybe 10 years if you're very disciplined. Her face fell as she realized I'd done the math. But you won't be disciplined, will you, Brittany? Because this isn't the first time you've done something like this, and it won't be the last. You're a thief. It's who you are. That's not true, she protested, but there was no conviction in her voice. David came back inside, his face set with determination. Brittany, pack your things. I want you out of the apartment tonight. David, no. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work it out. You stole from my mother, he said flatly. You forged her signature. You lied to me for months. You tried to profit from her death. And you told her she didn't matter because she was old. There's nothing to work out. Brittany looked back and forth between us, finally understanding that her tears and excuses weren't going to save her this time. Fine, she said, her voice turning cold. But don't think this is over. I know things about both of you. I have rights as David's wife. Not for much longer, David said quietly. After they left, I sat in my living room feeling strangely empty. I'd gotten what I wanted. Brittany was exposed, David was angry at her instead of me, and justice was finally in motion. But I also felt drained, exhausted by the emotional toll of the confrontation. My phone rang around midnight. David's name appeared on the screen. Mom, I'm at a hotel. I couldn't stay in the apartment with her tonight. I'm glad you're safe, I said. I keep thinking about all the times I should have questioned what was happening. All the signs I ignored because it was easier than confronting the truth. David, you were manipulated too. She's very good at what she does. That doesn't excuse it. I let my wife steal from you. I let her exclude you from our wedding. I failed you as a son. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. We both made mistakes, but we can learn from them. Can we? Can we really come back from this? It was the question I'd been asking myself for days. Could we rebuild our relationship after everything that had happened? Could I trust him again? Could he forgive himself? I don't know, I said honestly, but I'd like to try. That seemed to be enough for now. We talked for another hour, David asking questions about the fraud, trying to understand the full scope of his wife's betrayal. For the first time in 2 years, we had a real conversation. Honest, painful, but real. After we hung up, I went to bed feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not for things to go back to the way they were, but for the possibility of building something new and better on the ruins of what we'd lost. Outside my bedroom window, the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Lawyers, investigators, the messy business of untangling Britney's web of lies. But tonight, I slept better than I had in weeks. For the first time since arriving at that airport, I felt like I might actually survive this. A week passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. Detective Martinez kept me updated on the investigation's progress, while Richard Hayes worked on disputing the fraudulent charges. The credit card companies were surprisingly cooperative once they saw the police report and evidence of forgery. David called every day, usually in the evening after work. Our conversations were careful, tentative, like two people learning to walk again after an accident. He'd moved into a studio apartment across town and filed for divorce. Brittany, according to him, had been staying with friends and making increasingly desperate attempts to contact him. She keeps saying she has something that will change everything, he told me during one of our talks. Some kind of evidence that will prove she's not the bad guy in all this. I doubted that very much. In my experience, people like Brittany always believed they had one more card to play, one more angle to work. It was part of what made them dangerous. I was proven right the following Tuesday when my doorbell rang at 8 in the morning. Through the peephole, I could see Brittany standing on my porch, looking disheveled and desperate. She was holding a manila envelope and shifting from foot to foot like she was working up courage. I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door but kept the chain latched. "What do you want, Brittany?" "Mrs. Thompson, please. I need to talk to you. I have something you need to see. We have nothing to discuss. Any communication should go through the lawyers. It's about David," she said quickly, "about things you don't know about your son. Please, just give me 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I let her in. She looked terrible. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes wrinkled, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the $48,000. "You have 5 minutes," I said, not inviting her to sit down. She opened the envelope with trembling hands and pulled out a stack of photographs. "I know you think I'm the only bad person in this situation, but your son isn't innocent either." The first photo showed David at what looked like a casino, sitting at a blackjack table with chips stacked in front of him. The second showed him at what appeared to be a high-end bar, laughing with a woman I didn't recognize. More photos followed. David at expensive restaurants, David shopping in stores that looked well beyond his salary range, David clearly living a lifestyle that should have been impossible on his income. "These were taken over the past year," Brittany said, watching my face carefully. "David has a gambling problem, Mrs. Thompson, and he's been cheating on me." I looked at the photographs more carefully. They were clearly recent. David's hair was the length he'd been wearing it for the past 6 months, and I recognized some of the clothes. But something about them felt staged, artificial. "Where did you get these?" I asked. "I hired a private investigator. I suspected something was wrong and I needed proof." I set the photos down on my coffee table. "What does this have to do with the money you stole from me?" "He knew," she said, her voice gaining strength. "David knew about the credit cards. He knew because he was the one who suggested it. He said his mother had more money than she could ever spend, and it wasn't fair for it to just sit there while we struggled." The lie was so transparent I almost laughed. "So you're saying this was all David's idea?" "Not all of it," she backpedaled quickly. "But he knew about the wedding expenses. He knew I was using your credit to pay for things. He just didn't want to be directly involved so he could claim innocence if we got caught." I picked up one of the photos again, studying it more closely. Something about David's posture looked wrong, too stiff. The lighting was inconsistent between shots. And the woman he was supposedly cheating with was turned away from the camera in every single photo, her face never visible. "These are fake," I said. "What?" "No, they're not. I have the investigator's report. They're fake," I repeated more firmly. "Photoshopped. You had these made to try to discredit David and make yourself look like a victim instead of a thief." Brittany's face went white. "That's not. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. This is your last desperate attempt to manipulate the situation. You thought if you could convince me that David was equally guilty, I'd back down from pressing charges." She started crying again, but these tears felt different from the ones she'd shed during our confrontation the week before. These were tears of panic, of someone who'd played their final card and realized it wasn't enough. "Mrs. Thompson, please. I'm desperate. The police called yesterday. They want me to come in for an interview. I could go to prison." "Yes," I said calmly. "You could, but I'm young. I made mistakes, but I'm young and I can change. Prison would ruin my life." I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake worrying about money, all the times I'd felt confused and excluded from my son's life, all the moments I'd questioned my own worth because of her systematic manipulation. "You should have thought about that before you stole from me," I said. "Before you canceled my tickets to David's wedding, before you told me I was almost dead anyway." I was angry. I say things when I'm angry. Everyone does. No, Brittany, not everyone does. Not everyone is capable of the cruelty you showed me that day. She was crying harder now, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "What do you want from me? What will it take for you to drop the charges?" "Nothing," I said simply. "There's nothing you can offer me that would make this go away. You stole from me, lied to my son, and tried to position yourself to profit from my death. Those are the facts, and no amount of fake photographs or crocodile tears will change them. You're destroying my life over money. Just money." "No," I said, walking to the door and opening it. "You destroyed your own life over money. I'm just refusing to let you destroy mine too." She gathered up her fake photographs with shaking hands. As she reached the door, she turned back one more time. "This isn't over," she said, her voice suddenly cold and hard. "I know people. I have connections. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Get out," I said quietly, "and don't come back." After she left, I called Richard Hayes and told him about the visit and the fake photographs. He wasn't surprised. "Desperate people do desperate things," he said. "The fact that she went to the trouble of having fake evidence created actually works in our favor. It shows consciousness of guilt and intent to obstruct justice." I also called Detective Martinez, who was very interested in the photographs and Brittany's attempt to intimidate me. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand that what just happened could be construed as witness tampering. That's a serious charge on top of everything else we're investigating." That evening, David came over for dinner. It was the first time he'd been in my house since the night of the confrontation, and we were both nervous. But as we cooked together, spaghetti with meat sauce, his childhood favorite, some of the old ease began to return. I told him about Brittany's visit and showed him the fake photographs. He looked at them with a mixture of amazement and disgust. "She actually thought you'd believe I was gambling and cheating," he said. "Mom, you raised me. You know me better than anyone." "Do I?" I asked gently. "A month ago, I would have said I knew you'd never let your wife steal from me, but you did let it happen, even if you didn't know the details." He set down his fork and looked at me directly. "You're right. I failed you. I was so focused on being a good husband that I forgot about being a good son. I let Brittany isolate you from our lives because it was easier than dealing with the conflict." "Why?" I asked. "What were you afraid would happen if you stood up to her?" "I was afraid she'd leave me," he said simply. "And I was afraid of being alone." It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. I reached across the table and took his hand. "David, you're never going to be alone as long as I'm alive. But you can't let fear of abandonment make you abandon the people who actually love you." We talked until almost midnight, really talked for the first time in 2 years. He told me about the gradual way Brittany had undermined his relationships with friends and family, making him dependent on her for social connections and emotional support. I told him about the loneliness and confusion I'd felt as I was systematically excluded from his life. "I want to make this right," he said as he prepared to leave. "I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to earn back your trust. It's going to take time," I warned him. And it's going to require you to make some hard choices about who you want to be going forward. I understand. And Mom, whatever happens with the criminal case, whatever consequences Britney faces, I support you completely. She brought this on herself. After he left, I sat in my living room feeling more hopeful than I had in months. My relationship with David wasn't fixed. That would take time and continued effort from both of us. But for the first time, I believed it could be healed. The house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't in years. Not just quiet, but peaceful. Like the tension that had been building for so long had finally been released. My phone rang once around 11, an unknown number that I didn't answer. It rang again at 11:30, then stopped. I had a feeling I knew who it was, making one last attempt to rattle me, to make me second-guess my decision to press charges. But I was done being rattled, done being manipulated, done being anyone's victim. Tomorrow, Detective Martinez would likely arrest Britney for fraud, forgery, and witness tampering. There would be court dates and lawyers and all the messy business of justice. But tonight, I went to bed feeling something I hadn't felt in 2 years, safe in my own life. I had survived Britney's attempts to erase me, steal from me, and turn my son against me. More than that, I had fought back and won. The scared, confused woman who had stood in the airport a few weeks ago was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't accept anything less than respect from the people in her life. It was a hard lesson, learned at great cost. But as I drifted off to sleep, I found myself grateful for it. Sometimes the most painful experiences are the ones that teach us who we really are. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee on a Saturday morning, listening to the birds outside my window and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. Not the absence of problems, but the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you will and won't accept in your life. Britney had been sentenced 3 weeks earlier to 18 months in prison and 5 years of probation. The judge had been particularly harsh about the attempted insurance fraud, calling it a calculated plan to profit from the victim's death. Watching her led away in handcuffs should have given me satisfaction, but all I felt was relief that it was finally over. The restitution process had been surprisingly successful. Most of the fraudulent charges had been reversed, and my credit score was slowly recovering. More importantly, I'd learned to monitor my accounts carefully and had established safeguards that would prevent anyone from accessing my information again. But the real healing had been in my relationship with David. He arrived that morning right on time, carrying a bag of fresh bagels from the place downtown we'd discovered together. It had become our Saturday tradition: breakfast and conversation, rebuilding trust one meal at a time. "How are you feeling about today?" he asked as he poured himself coffee. Today was special. David's divorce had been finalized yesterday, and for the first time in 2 years, he was completely free of Britney's influence. No shared assets, no ongoing legal ties, no reason for her to ever contact him again. "Relieved?" I said honestly. "It feels like we can finally move forward instead of always looking backward." He nodded, settling into the chair across from me. "I've been thinking about what you said about making hard choices about who I want to be. I think I'm finally ready to figure that out." Over the past 6 months, David had been in therapy, working through the ways Britney had manipulated him and isolated him from his support network. It had been painful for him to recognize how thoroughly he'd been controlled, but it had also been liberating. "I want to tell you something," he said, his voice serious. "About the wedding, about excluding you from it." I set down my coffee cup. We talked about many aspects of what had happened, but David had never fully explained his role in the decision to cancel my tickets. "She told me you'd called and said you didn't want to come," he continued. "She said you were embarrassed about not being able to afford a nice outfit, and you'd rather just skip it and celebrate with us quietly when we got back." The lie was so perfectly crafted I could almost admire Britney's skill. She'd played on David's knowledge of my modest means and my tendency to avoid being a burden on others. "Did you believe her?" I asked gently. "I wanted to believe her," he admitted. "Because if you didn't want to come, then I didn't have to deal with the conflict between what she wanted and what was right. It was easier to accept her version than to call you and ask directly." "And when I called from the airport?" I panicked. I realized something was wrong, but I was already at the altar, and Brittany was so upset about everything being perfect, and I chose the path of least resistance. It hurt to hear, but I appreciated his honesty. David had failed me that day, not out of malice but out of weakness and the desire to avoid difficult conversations. What would you do differently now? I asked. I would call you directly. I would trust my own judgment instead of letting someone else tell me what you were thinking or feeling. I would remember that my loyalty to you comes before my desire to keep the peace with anyone else. It was exactly what I needed to hear. Not just an apology, but evidence that he understood what had gone wrong and was committed to doing better. We spent the morning working in my garden together, something we'd started doing a few weeks earlier. David had never been particularly interested in gardening when he was younger, but now he seemed to find peace in the simple work of planting and weeding and nurturing growth. I've been thinking about taking some time off, he said, as we planted new rose bushes in the space where Harold's old vegetable garden used to be. Maybe traveling a little, figuring out what I actually want instead of just reacting to what other people want from me. That sounds healthy, I said. Where would you go? I was thinking about that national parks trip we used to talk about when I was a kid, remember? You and Dad always said we'd drive out west and see the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone. I did remember. It was one of those dreams that gets pushed aside by more immediate concerns, until suddenly it's been 20 years and the moment has passed. I'd love to do that, I said carefully, not wanting to assume I was included in his plans. Would you really? I know it would be a lot of time together, and after everything that's happened. David, I interrupted gently, I would love nothing more than to take that trip with you. His smile was the same one he'd had as a little boy, bright and uncomplicated and full of joy. That afternoon, Helen came over with a bottle of wine to celebrate David's divorce being final. The three of us sat on my back porch, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. You know what I'm most proud of? Helen said, raising her glass. Linda never became bitter. After everything that woman put you through, you could have turned angry and suspicious of everyone. Instead, you fought back with dignity and came out stronger. I thought about that as I got ready for bed later. It was true that I wasn't bitter, but it had been a conscious choice. There had been moments, especially in the early days after discovering the fraud, when I'd felt tempted to let anger consume me. It would have been easier in some ways to blame all men, all young women, all daughter-in-laws, to become the kind of person who saw threats everywhere. Instead, I'd chosen to see Britney's actions as specific to her, not representative of humanity in general. I'd chosen to work on healing my relationship with David rather than writing him off. I'd chosen to trust that most people are decent, even after learning that some people aren't. It hadn't always been easy, but it had been right. My phone buzzed with a text message. For just a moment, my body tensed with the old fear that it might be Brittany, trying one more manipulation from prison. But the message was from David. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for fighting for us. I love you, Mom. I typed back quickly. I love you too. Always. As I settled into bed, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, confused, hurt, questioning her own value and place in the world. She felt like a different person now, someone I'd known once but had grown beyond. The journey from victim to survivor hadn't been quick or easy. It had required me to face uncomfortable truths about my own passivity, my tendency to avoid conflict, even when conflict was necessary. It had required me to learn new skills, how to advocate for myself, how to set boundaries, how to trust my own perceptions even when others tried to convince me I was wrong. But most importantly, it had taught me that my worth wasn't dependent on other people's approval or inclusion. I was valuable because I existed, because I had lived a full life and had wisdom and love to offer. Whether other people recognized that value was their choice, but it didn't change the fundamental truth of who I was. I thought about Brittany, probably lying in a narrow prison bed right now, maybe finally beginning to understand the real cost of her choices. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't wish her harm. I simply didn't think about her much at all, which felt like the ultimate freedom. She had tried to erase me from my son's life, to make me invisible and irrelevant. Instead, she had forced me to discover my own strength, to reclaim my place in the world, and to build something better with David than what we'd had before. In trying to diminish me, she had made me larger. In trying to steal my future, she had given me back my present. In telling me I was almost dead, she had reminded me that I was very much alive. Outside my bedroom window, the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, maybe planning that national parks trip with David, maybe volunteering at the senior center, maybe simply enjoying another day of being exactly who I was without apology. But tonight, I fell asleep with a smile on my face, grateful for every hard-won lesson, every difficult choice, every moment that had brought me to this place of perfect, unshakable peace. I was 62 years old, and I had never been more alive. The woman who had stood confused and hurt in that airport was gone forever. In her place was someone who knew her own worth, who wouldn't accept less than respect, who understood that the best revenge isn't anger or bitterness, but the quiet satisfaction of a life lived on your own terms. Brittany had told me I was almost dead. She was wrong about that, as she had been wrong about so many things. I wasn't dying. I was finally learning how to live.